I mean, I will never call COVID a blessing because that just seems rude, but it did help in the writing of the book because I basically had nothing to do for a year. My life is very busy, in certain chunks like anyone else's, but because I cover movies, my evenings and weekends are often very full of like festivals and things like that. And so I have very little consistent free time, but because I had all these empty weekends where the only thing I could really do is like go walk around in the park or watch more TV, I had all this time to read and write.
Alissa Wilkinson wrote her book Salty during the first year of the pandemic, and that definitely left its mark on both the process and the content.
Well, my husband, who helped me edit it quite a bit, but he would say it's a book about hope in dark times, which I think is correct. It's also a book about just gathering and the importance of gathering, especially around food, which was a very weird thing to be writing when that was the only thing I definitely wasn't doing. So there's little bits of myself in there that feel like a memoir of a hard year. That's not the focus of the book, but it comes through in certain chapters.
Alissa tells us all about how Salty and her first book came into this world, plus a little bit about her current Joan Didion-related project. We also talk about how book writing fits in amid her daily journalism grind, her unique path from academic to more traditional publishing, and more in today's episode.
There's nothing to writing. All you do is sit down at a typewriter and bleed.
Welcome to The Bleeders, a podcast and support group about book writing and publishing. I'm writer and podcaster Courtney Kosak, and each week I'll bring you new conversations with authors, agents, and publishers about how to write and sell books.
Hi, my name is Alissa Wilkinson, and I'm the author of Salty, Lessons on Eating, Drinking, and Living from Revolutionary Women.
I had such an amazing conversation with Alissa about the writing process for her books. But before we get into that, let's get to know her with the 5 questions.
When did you first identify as a writer?
I don't actually know when I did. I was trying to think about this question recently, and I think I was really hesitant to identify as a writer for a long time. Honestly, sometimes I am still. I'll often say, like, I'm a critic or I'm a journalist or something like that. I think because my idea of the writing life, big quotes around that, was very much like someone who sits at their desk all day and, works on their book and, like, has like toil over their creative life, and that just wasn't me. But at some point someone said to me, well, like, you write things, so you're a writer. And I was like, oh, right.
Yeah,
I guess that's
your
true.
Full-time job.
Yes, exactly.
What's your all-time favorite book?
I really love this book called The Supper of the Lamb, which is a food book that Ruth Reichel put into the Modern Food Library series. And it's sort of a cookbook, and it's sort of just this really delightful, meandering, sort of roving exploration of like why food is so important and good. It was actually written by an Episcopal priest who used to, among other things, write about food for the New York Times. And he tells you at the outset that he's going to tell you how to make lamb 6 ways for 8 people, but he keeps getting distracted, like telling hilarious stories. And so I love this book, and every time I tell someone to read it, they come back to me and they're like, you were right.
I feel like this sounds familiar, and I've just been reading your book. Is it mentioned in the book?
I think I mentioned it once. I actually way back when I was trying to think about the book, thought I might write something that was more of an homage to The Supper of the Lamb, but that one's still on the back burner.
What's your dream writing routine?
If I could, and once in a while I can, set up my day perfectly, it's where I like go out for a walk in the morning. I live near Prospect Park in Brooklyn, so I like go out and sort of look at the ducks on the pond and, enjoy people's dogs and drink my coffee and sort of think about what I'm doing for the day. And then I just have like a long expanse of a day that is free to me to write in kind of as it works for me. And sometimes this works out, but that would involve coffee. And then, at some point you like pour a glass of wine and read through what you read and get out the pen and sort of edit it. And then I'm able to put it away at a reasonable hour and go watch a movie or something in the evening.
Yeah, live your life. What's the real writing routine?
So my day job does involve writing, and it often involves writing to a very tight deadline. I do write about movies, and so a lot of times it's like you see the movie and then it's coming out in 2 days, so I have to turn it around fast. However, I have learned one thing about myself, which is that I do not write well in the mornings. So I tend to try to reserve my mornings for meetings and, reading other people's work or any research I might have to do, and then in the afternoon kind of pick it up. And luckily, I'm a very fast writer, so usually I can sort of bang out a draft in an afternoon, at least a passable draft. And I like to write at least a portion of something. If I know I'm not going to be able to get it done, I try to get at least 400 to 600 words done in one day so that I can pick it up the next morning. When it comes to writing a book, I have to fit it in around my day job. And so I schedule myself reading, which is a big part of the kinds of books that I write, just tons and tons of primary and secondary sources. I schedule that throughout the week or throughout the month. And then I block out one weekend per month to write the draft, which is actually a physically taxing thing to do because a lot of times chapters are like 8,000 words long. But that way I can kind of get it all out of my head at once, which just works better for me. I am not one of those people who writes like 150 words a day. I'm very happy for people who can do that, but it completely doesn't work for me. And then after I write that chapter, I don't look at it till the next month. And that's my routine at this point.
Oh, that's so interesting how you like divide it up like that.
Yeah.
Does stuff like this, like I have to stack all my interviews that I do on one day, or like my energy is totally shot? Do you do things like that to manage is it to manage your energy or just to make sure you get a better draft? Or
Yeah, it's to manage my energy. It's because a lot of the writing I do sort of sits on the borderline between historical, reported, and critical. And so to do that well, you really need to, I don't always know what the argument or even the thesis is going to be when I'm going into it. And so doing it all in a big chunk means that I'm like in that brain space, and I feel like all those pieces that are swirling around above my head, I can kind of grab. But one thing I do with book writing is I tend to retype out everything from the books that I've been reading that is relevant to the chapter that I think I'm writing. And so the act of typing it helps me to see the words that I read. And that means that they're in my head. And then I can be like, wait, there was a quote about this, and I can go find it in my notes. It's laborious, like maybe too laborious. Certainly not efficient, but it definitely helps with me being able to kind of pull all of the pieces together.
yeah. Oh, I love that. Okay, one piece of writing that makes you jealous you didn't write it.
There's so many of these. It's really kind of disturbing. I guess if I were to just pick one, I'm working on something about Joan Didion right now for my next book. And so I've been reading everything that she wrote many, many times over. And of course, a lot of what she wrote is really admirable and interesting. But I've actually been reading her film criticism. And one thing I love about it is that a lot of people don't know that she wrote film criticism, which is extra fun. But also her film criticism has this sense of like, she just likes movies to be fun. They don't really have to be very good, but for her, like a movie that she didn't have fun watching in some way just is a bad movie. And I kind of admire the way that she, who is sort of famously an overthinker in her writing, when it came to film criticism, she was like, no, like we all know this is nonsense at best. So let's just treat it that way. And I really admire that attitude.
That's amazing. Okay, so criticism and food kind of, intersect with your writing life. So how did those things all come together?
So I've been writing criticism for 15 or 16 years now, professionally, in sort of more or less professional capacity. I started doing it really honestly because I had a day job in financial technology after college. And I was really bored and kind of miserable. And I was just like, I can't believe I'm going to be doing this the rest of my life, which obviously I didn't end up doing. And so I just sort of started writing for fun. I had moved to New York City. I was dating a guy who I, eventually married who was working in film. So we were just like going to see a lot of movies. And I was like, I don't know, there's like a lot here to talk about. So I started writing it for various like little web publications. You know how sometimes you just like write a lot of stuff for free just to get out there and get your brain working. And the thing is, if you keep doing it long enough and if you're like halfway decent at it, then people tend to take notice, especially on the internet. And, by about 10 years ago or 15 years ago now, I guess, I started sort of hearing from publications like, do you want to write a review of this movie for us or something like that? I expanded myself to writing about a little bit about art, books, television, of course, music once in a while. And then I just sort of wound up doing it a lot as a freelancer for big publications. And then Vox, where I currently work, was hiring someone to cover film 6 years ago, or a little over 6 years ago, and they called me because the editor at the time had been reading me for a while. So it was kind of a funky, strange way to get into the industry, but here I am with like a staff position where I mostly write about movies and TV.
That's very cool.
Yeah, and then in the meantime, and I'm sort of skipping many steps in between, but I ended up earning a MFA in creative nonfiction. And my thesis advisor knew I was like kind of obsessed with food writing. I just love to cook, and so I love to read good writers on food. And she said, why don't you take a quarter to just read food writing and write about it? So I did that. And that kind of got me thinking about what makes for good food writing. And so all of these things started to come together when a book editor, the editor who edited my last book, approached me and said, do you have a book? And I was like, I don't want to write a book. Writing books sucks. It's like so much work. And she was like, well, just think about it. And I remembered that I'd had a conversation once with a mentor who said, you should write a book called Cocktails with Hannah, meaning a book about Hannah Arendt's famous cocktail party, the philosopher who had all these cocktail parties in the middle of the 20th century. And I was like, Robert, I don't think that's like a whole book. But then when I thought about it, I was like, that's the seed of a good idea. And so I wound up picking 9 women who I found really interesting from the 20th century, artists, intellectuals. Some of them are cooks and chefs and food writers, and a lot of them are not. And just thinking, what can I find in their stories that is food related that I can hang like a bigger story about them and who they are and what they teach us upon? Yeah, and so that's kind of how I ended up. I was like, this is the only way I'm going to write a book. I ended up writing it that way, and it was a really good way to combine those things. And so when I came to my next book, which I'm working on now, I had to kind of find another innovative way into the story I wanted to tell, which is about Hollywood, American myth-making, a whole bunch of cultural figures, Joan Didion being one of them.
Okay, so all of that is fascinating. Let's back up just a little bit and go back to when and why you decided to get your MFA, because you were doing this online writing, and what kind of prompted that?
Yeah, so I had already earned one master's degree basically as a way to get myself out of this financial technology job, which is what I was trained for in college. So I got a job at NYU in the IT department as a writer, so I could like sort of ease my way out. They have a whole writing department within the IT departments.
About tech?
Yeah, it's a very big university, so there's just a lot. So it was mostly tech writing, but there's an in-house magazine that I was editing. An in-house tech magazine. NYU is very big. In-house tech magazine that I edited and wrote a lot of, not really knowing how to write a journalistic article. And I don't know if I would really call it journalism, but it meant I would like interview people and write articles. And so I was getting a little bit of that at work. In the meantime, I got a master's in the humanities, which is just sort of an interdisciplinary degree. I really liked it. And as I was in one of those classes, I took a class in the English department on like the modern English novel or something one summer. And the professor said something offhand that I'd never heard of. My parents didn't go to college or anything. I didn't really grow up around I guess, like intellectuals, but giant air quotes around that. So I didn't know this, but he said, "Oh, if you have a master's in anything in the liberal arts, then you should try teaching freshman composition on the college level because colleges always need adjunct instructors. And like if you don't like it after the first semester, you never have to do it again." And I was like, interesting." So I emailed the one person I knew who I thought might do some hiring at like this tiny little liberal arts college, which is where I currently teach still. And I said, "Hey, I'm finishing my master's. Like, I don't know if you guys need anything for the fall, but I'd be interested." And he said, "Actually, yeah, we totally do. We need someone to teach a freshman writing course." And I said, "Okay, sign me up."
That was a hot tip.
Yes. And it was a really good tip, as it turns out, a great tip for me because it went really well. I was 25 when I did this, and I was teaching college students, how to write. And
my God.
it was a little scary, but I was like, what can I do? So I sort of flew by the seat of my pants. Then they hired me to teach the second semester course the next semester. That went really well. And midway through, they were like, "Actually, we have a full-time position opening. Do you want it?" And I was like, "Yes, I would like this full-time college teaching position." And so I took it. And then in the meantime, they said, "This is going really well. We really, everyone's likes you here. But if you want to keep doing this full time, you really need to be working towards a terminal degree." I believe at the time I was like, "What is a terminal degree?" I Googled it and figured out that I could either get a PhD or an MFA. And PhD seemed like a lot of work. And I was like, I'm a writer. An MFA will be easy. I already write. How hard could it be? Well, it turns out it's really hard work, but it was really good work. And I enrolled in a low residency MFA. So that took 2 years. It was like really good for me in particular. I don't know that it's good for everyone, but I usually describe it to people as like I could have learned everything that I did learn in the MFA on my own. But I felt like it shoved me through about 10 years of like crap. And then when I was done, I was definitely substantially better writer than I was at the beginning of the program. And I had to read a lot and I had to sort of learn to articulate what is good and what is not good in a piece of writing. And that helped me become a better teacher. And I, built a community as well of people who I think are good readers, which is really what you need as a writer. And then at the end, I had an MFA, which was nice as well. And it meant I could be a full-time professor.
Totally. So did you start a book length project during that MFA or?
They didn't let us.
Really?
It was an unusual program in that they said, "We really want the focus to be on you building a writing life. And we find that people who focus too much on getting a book deal, which often happens in MFAs, tend to become like very competitive and very networky and very kind of climbing the ladder, which I totally get. So we just want you to forget about a book for 2 years." And my creative thesis was like a 10 essay collection, basically. But they weren't essays that you would publish together in a book. And I wouldn't publish most of them at this point. But that, back then, 10 years ago, that's what it was. I know some people have sort of wheedled their way into publishing a book out of that program. But in general, I think that was a good focus. And they said, if you can write good essays, then you can write a book, which is probably true.
Your first book that I found on the internet was How to Survive the Apocalypse. Is that correct?
Yes, that is. Yeah, that was co-written. So, yeah.
Can you set up that premise and then we'll get into a little bit about how that worked and what you learned?
Yeah, so that book is kind of, it was a funny thing. So I co-wrote it with an old coworker who is a political science professor. And we had shared a mutual love of like zombie shows for a long time. So I think that book came out in 2016. So in 2014, we were both still pretty early career academics, and we were writing here and there. but you kind of need a book to advance in your career. So we came up with this. He really came up with the idea and was like, do you want to write this with me? And I said, sounds fun. And the idea was to explore a particular philosopher of modernity that both of us teach to some degree in our work, but to explore him through apocalyptic TV for the most part. So it's like Game of Thrones and The Walking Dead, and we found a way to like shoehorn Mad Men in there and stuff like that. It's a very like of the early 2010s book, I think. And so we split up the chapters, and he would send me his chapters, and then I would kind of rewrite them to sound like I wrote them because I'm the better writer of the two of us. And the goal was always it is a very academic topic, but the goal was to make it extremely accessible and interesting to people who had never read the underlying theorist. And I would say in early 2016, the title How to Survive the Apocalypse did not feel quite the same way as it does now when I look back at it.
Now it's like we need a handbook. Jesus.
I know, right? So, so the goal was just to sort of make a very accessible book. It did kind of end up coming out of the academic side of our publisher and sort of being treated that way, I think, but that was fine. And as a process, it was pretty much, for me anyhow, it felt like I was writing criticism. It didn't feel that far off of what I normally do because I would rewatch something and then I'd think about how it fit the idea of the chapter, and then I would just sort of write my way through it. And I think at the end of the day, it's pretty accessible. The first couple chapters are a little dense in the way that academic texts tend to be, but people are kind of tickled by the idea of reading this very complex set of ideas through something as goofy as The Walking Dead. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. So it sounds like the process was pretty smooth. Like you were kind of the ultimate editor. Was there anything that you learned about writing partnerships that you would not repeat, or any tips on how to approach that?
In general, the writing part went really easily, in part because we'd worked together for so long and we had co-written a couple articles together in the past. So
that helps.
I think the thing that was reinforced for me, or that was most important, was you have to really trust your co-writer. I mean, he had to trust me that if I was going to tweak or substantially kind of rewrite his paragraphs, that they would have the same meaning at the end that they did when he sent them to me. But we had that trust established already over kind of a long working relationship. I would say the only thing I learned that I wished I had thought about earlier was I am a more assertive person than he is. I'm American, he's Canadian. That might have something to do with it. And so I wish I had kind of involved myself more in the negotiation process with the publisher, which I just think is like a good thing to know generally if you don't have an agent, that you have to be fairly assertive, that they want your book. Like if they're talking to you about your book, they want your book. And so you are in essence hiring them to publish your book, and it's okay to tell them what you want. I sort of learned this by the end when we were in the cover process. I got very pushy about the cover because I really hated the cover they'd come up with. And I was like, no, I'm just not. You can take my name off the book if you're going to use that cover. And they weren't going to do that. So that was good that I kind of eventually got there. But that was the thing that I think I learned most out of that experience.
That's smart. So what came out of that? Did it kind of have the impact on your career that you hoped it would?
So it did help in that really the main goal, again, was just to kind of help the academic side of my career. And it was like a main piece in my promotion packet. And so I got promoted from assistant to associate professor. That's really what I was going for. And I think I also gained the confidence that I could write a book-length work, which was really important. And I actually signed a contract right after that for another short book that was going to be about kind of like religion and pop culture, sort of like the changing shape of religion as shown in pop, I don't know, something like that. But the publisher went under. So I actually wrote most of the book, and then the publisher went under, and then I just used pieces of it in my journalism because I wasn't totally confident in it as a book. But I had the confidence that it was possible for me to sit down and write something that long. And I think that was really helpful for me. Career-wise, otherwise, it's sort of like those things follow you around and people mention them, but especially when you write about pop culture, things get dated very, very fast,
right.
And I knew that going in, and we joked about it, and it wasn't something that really bugged me, but it was something that I definitely would have thought about beforehand if I had like a different set of goals. But yeah, it came out in 2016, and I basically was like, I just don't feel like I want to write another book anytime soon, because now I know the amount of obsession with your topic that you need to have, and like how annoying it is to then talk about it for years afterwards if you're not interested in the topic itself.
Okay, well, I hope that wasn't too painful.
No,
we'll move on
not
to
at all.
Salty.
No. I haven't even thought about it very much lately, so it's been funny to be like, yeah, that book, it's pretty good.
Yeah. Okay, so Salty came out in June. Is that correct?
That is right.
Set up that kind of premise and the full title and who it's about.
So the full title is Salty: Lessons on Eating, Drinking, and Living from Revolutionary Women. I started with a list of 9 or 10 women, and then somewhere along the way, as I was sort of developing the idea, I think I scrapped about half of them and added different women. So they're not obviously related to one another, although there are like tiny parts where they might have crossed paths, or there's one place where like they dated the same guy, but it was like 20 years apart, something like that. But they were selected mainly because I find them interesting. And I was like, well, I'm the narrative throughput in this book, so it's me that drives the table of contents, basically. And as I said, the editor of the book approached me in, I want to say, probably the summer of 2019, I think. BEA was happening in New York City, and she was in town and called me. And she said, well, just go home and think about a book. And I kind of went home and I thought about it. And then she pinged me like 6 months later and was like, so? And I said, this is the only way I'm going to write this book, is if it can be about these 9 people. And to her credit, she was like, okay, sure, go for it. Now, the funniest part of the whole thing was that it wasn't funny. It was kind of dark, actually. I signed the contract like the day that the world started shutting down in March 2020.
Yeah, I saw in the foreword. I want to know how COVID impacted this whole process.
I mean, I will never call COVID a blessing, because that just seems rude, but it did help in the writing of the book, because I basically had nothing to do for a year. My life is very busy, in certain chunks, like anyone else's, but because I cover movies, my evenings and weekends are often very full of like festivals and things like that. And so I have very little consistent free time. But because I had all these empty weekends where the only thing I could really do is like go walk around in the park or watch more TV, I had all this time to read and write. And that was really, really lovely for me. So I signed the contract in March 2020. Completely separately from that, I got an email from my now agent, who at the time was just a random person cold calling me from the internet that same week. So that happened totally separately. I did Salty without an agent. And then I started writing it. I really didn't start writing the book till September, but because it's basically 9 chapters long, I just sort of worked it out that I would write 1 per month. The first 2 times I even like rented myself an Airbnb upstate and went up and wrote it, which was like really helpful in getting the first couple chapters down. And then after that, I would just write them at home because I felt like I was in a groove and I kind of had an office space. Yeah, and I finished it. I turned in the final-ish draft, the final first draft on Memorial Day weekend, 2021, which was it felt like I was living in a completely different world than I had been, obviously, in, a year earlier.
Yeah, no shit. Crazy.
Yeah, I was even like outdoors at a bar when I finished the last chapter, and that felt like monumental, right? And it also felt like this is a book about, well, my husband, who helped me edit it quite a bit, but he would say it's a book about hope in dark times, which I think is correct. It's also a book about just gathering and the importance of gathering, especially around food, which was a very weird thing to be writing when that was the only thing I definitely wasn't doing. Mm-hmm. So there's little bits of myself in there that feel like a memoir of a hard year. That's not the focus of the book, but it comes through in certain chapters. Yeah, and then, it took, I don't know, 6 months or something to get the edits done. They had these beautiful illustrations. I'm really happy with the final product. And then it came out in June. So these things take so much time.
That's pretty fast, though, isn't it?
It is.
For a book from start to finish?
Yeah, I mean, it helps that it's not a very long book. So I'm trying to remember exactly how long it is. I think it's 60,000 words or 70,000. It's something like that. I knew it was going to be kind of gift book sized, which is what it came out to. I'm really happy they put it out in hardcover for that reason. Each essay in it is, I believe, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 words long. So for me, that's like a long magazine article, which again, I knew I could write because I do it all the time. So that confidence really translated well when I sat down to write. I just thought like, oh, just write another article. And that was really good. And it just helped that the research process for it really didn't involve anything like interviews or anything like that. I just would read biographies. I would, if the person wrote novels, I would read a whole bunch of the novels. One chapter is on the filmmaker Agnes Varda. And there's a Criterion Collection boxed set that is the complete works of Agnes Varda. So I bought it and I spent one Saturday morning every week for like maybe 3 months just watching an entire disc. And that was great, and I felt like I was meeting these people sometimes for sort of the first time and really getting to know them and then trying to share them with the reader.
Yeah, I definitely wanted to talk about the research process. So it was kind of like regimented because it's definitely threaded throughout the book and it seems like very thorough.
Yeah, I'm like a giant academic nerd. And so I had to sort of almost make a syllabus for myself every month where I would sit down and say, okay, like here's the 10 books I pulled that I'm going to read. And then I would divide them up mathematically into how many pages I needed to read per day from which books. And I would do that and stuck to it pretty consistently, which again was much easier because I wasn't doing anything else. Right. So after work, I would sit down on the couch and read for a few hours. And I have like little sticky flags. I mean, everyone does. I have a billion of them just scattered everywhere in my house. Everywhere you look, there's like little sticky flags. And I use them to mark, bits of interest. And I find that reading all that stuff in a really compressed time frame meant that I was skimming sometimes, but it also meant I was quickly developing knowledge of what I was looking for, which was often like trying to find some hook into their life or sometimes food, just because, for instance, there's a chapter on Octavia Butler, the science fiction novelist. Food was not an obvious thing with her. I really had to dig on that one. But as soon as I kind of ran across it in a novel, I was like, wait, I see what's going on here. I see what I can do with this. And then I would sit down with all those notes and I would type them all out. And that would help me sort of see a structure start to emerge in front of me. And then I would, sit down on a weekend and draft the chapter.
So you said you had a list and then you doubled it of these women and then you pared it back down.
Yeah.
So how did you ultimately select who was included? What was kind of your rubric?
So one thing I didn't want to do was have anybody that would be expected in a book about women and food. I didn't want to put MFK Fisher in. I love MFK Fisher, but I felt like there's a lot of books about MFK Fisher. We don't need another chapter on her. Even if you don't know who she is, she's very easy to find books about. I didn't want to put Julia Child in the book for that same reason, right? So I was looking for a balance of, I didn't want it to be all about like white women writers, you know? And I didn't want it to be all about chefs or something like that. So I tried to spread it out a little. At the same time, I knew that because this is my preferences and interests coming through, it's very heavily about people who spent a lot of time either in the US or in Paris, particular, where I've spent a lot of time, or sometimes both, just because those are the people who I've kind of bumped into in the past and found interesting for one reason or another. There were some people who I was like, I really want the excuse to read everything they wrote. Yeah. The one that springs to mind is Patricia Highsmith, who wrote the Ripley novels and other things. But the thing that it was like almost an intrusive thought was the moment in the movie Carol, which is based on her book, The Price of Salt, where Kate Blanchett shows up at the restaurant and orders creamed spinach with a poached egg and a martini. And creamed spinach is like so gross to me. I have like a real texture aversion, and that I just can't deal with it. And I was like, oh no, I can't talk about Patricia Highsmith. She also doesn't seem to have liked food very much, which felt like I was like, oh, I mean, I really like her. I'm really interested in her. And then I was sort of browsing my bookshelves and landed on the idea of substituting Laurie Colwin for her, which turned out to be a really good idea because a lot of people don't know Laurie Colwin, but everybody should. So that was the process. And really, I think I landed on 9 because that would land me in the page count that I had been contracted. I mean, this is all very practical and kind of stupid at the end of the day, but I just wanted to find people I wanted to spend time with who intrigued me for one reason or another, even if I couldn't put my finger on it, and who represented like some kind of variety of life experience and of occupation and just of things that I thought they might tell me. And I wound up framing it as like, if I threw a dinner party, these are the people I would want to be there together.
Yeah. What was that painting that you mentioned in the...
Yeah. It's actually not a painting. It's an installation piece. So there is a piece called The Dinner Party, and the artist's name is completely escaping me at the moment. It's very famous. Anyhow, there's a piece called The Dinner Party. It is at the Brooklyn Museum, which is very close to my house. And you enter this room and there's like this giant 3-sided table, kind of like a triangle. And there's all these place settings at the table and there's place cards. And it's for all these women. And it turned out accidentally one man, but all these women
hilarious.
Who were, they just didn't know because Judy Chicago is the artist. And when the piece was made in the 70s, they didn't realize this person was a man. But they're kind of place cards, and they're settings for people who are basically being given a seat at the table that they were denied for one reason or another in the past, and sort of, making the point of like rewriting history through a feminist lens. And I wouldn't say that anyone in my book has necessarily been denied their place at the table, but some of them have definitely not gotten the full place they deserve. Edna Lewis, for instance, the chef, often is not included in histories of the farm to table movement, even though she's as important, if not much more, than Alice Waters. Or Ella Baker, who's an activist who's at least as important as Martin Luther King to the history of the civil rights movement, but she was much quieter and didn't give speeches, and so people don't really know about her. So, or many people, I should say, don't know about her. So just trying to kind of bring that, who would you want to meet at a dinner party? Maybe not people you already know so much as people that you will be glad you know at the end of the party.
Yeah. Very cool premise. Okay, so you do bang out those pieces for work. Like, were your drafts pretty close?
Yeah. For a variety of reasons, the editing process was a bit of a crunch. And so I write the one draft, set it aside, and then like edited it the next month before I started writing the new draft, and just kind of put me in that headspace. And then I really wouldn't look at it again. I think I gave it a once over, but I'm so used to editing as I go, because that's how I write, that generally my drafts are in pretty good shape. And I knew that just from experience. And then when I got book edits back, I had a couple months where we were in like pretty tight edits. And it turned out my husband actually I didn't know this, he's not a writer, but he's a great line editor, as it turns out. And so he went through kind of with a fine-tooth comb and was very helpful with that. So it didn't change shape substantially from the earliest draft. There's like one chapter that got a pretty big did a bunch of open heart surgery on it. But the other ones, a lot of them stayed pretty much the same. And I do think the fact that I have to write so much, just generally for my work, is very helpful here, because I do like sort of trust my voice. I know what's going to come out of me, and it's pretty consistent across the board.
And then you already had the publisher set up, so it wasn't like you had to go look for anyone.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing about nonfiction is that, well, I've never written a memoir, but anything like this, you usually sell it before you write it.
Did you have a book proposal?
I did not really write a book proposal for this one. I kind of wrote a table of contents that was explanatory, but the press was kind of already sold on the idea. So, and I've heard from other friends that this is something that they sometimes, especially their second book for the same press is a lot more chill, which it reminds me very much of my freelancing days where you had to craft a really perfect pitch the first time you pitched a magazine. And then after that, it was very like, hey, I just think maybe I have some ideas about The Leftovers. Can I write about it? So it wasn't all that different. So then, so for this next one, I did write a proposal. And the proposal was a long process. So I took a meeting over Zoom, of course, with this agent, my agent, Laura. And we were just talking about ideas. I hadn't signed with her yet. And I had an idea for a book that I still kind of want to do. And she was like, well, this is a really good idea, but I've always thought I wanted to work on a book that was sort of related to Joan Didion. And I was like, oh, yes. Like, I've written a lot about Didion over the years, and I think there's probably something there. I was like, well, let me just read a lot, and then I'll come back to you with an idea. And I wound up thinking about Hollywood a lot, reading her biography and realizing that, like, not a lot of people had written about that part of her life. And so that proposal I started working on, essentially in May 2020. And I think we didn't even send it out for a year. It took that long to really refine it, write the table of contents. You need 2 chapters in a nonfiction proposal. I had to write those chapters. It was just like a lot of work. Yeah. And then it was out for sale for 6 months, I think, before it sold.
I read that you were a writing fellow at Sundance Institute's Art of Nonfiction Initiative. Mm-hmm. Did that fit into any of these things that you were working on, or how did that work?
So the Art of Nonfiction Initiative was within the documentary program there, and they were trying out something where they were bringing in writers and critics to kind of work alongside their filmmaking fellows. And Art of Nonfiction was about like innovative documentary, so not so much what you might see on PBS, but sort of more experimental, I guess, that kind of thing.
Ethically dubious.
Yeah, well, sometimes. Or sometimes just like, like a memoir is not exactly the kind of documentary you expect to see, right? And it's the kind of thing people have been making for a really long time, but often in Europe. So my job was to, well, it was unclear, but the idea was that we would be around, we went to some programming, and then we also would work on like some pieces, and I was writing about documentary. In the end, it was really useful for me because it helped me as a film writer solidify some of the bonds between creative nonfiction filmmaking and creative nonfiction writing, which I think are there but are underexplored at the moment. So I love writing about nonfiction. Of course, like there's so much of it out there that it's only been a boom since that time. But one thing that can be hard as a film writer is if you don't have a great knowledge of how filmmakers think, then you can kind of draw the wrong conclusions about what they're trying to do or why they did what they did. Or you might be like, oh, it's a mistake, when in fact, rarely are there actually mistakes in films. They're usually very purposeful. And so that's a lot of what that was about. So it's all kinds of, it's like indirectly related. Everything's kind of indirectly related, but it wasn't specifically part of the book projects.
Okay, cool. You have a lot of cool stuff going on. Do you have any bucket list writing goals?
I would say my bucket list writing goal at this point is to like have more time to write.
I feel that.
Which is really just about money. But I would also, everyone kind of has the thing. I would love to someday attempt to write fiction, which is a thing that I find like baffling. And part of the reason I did nonfiction in grad school was because I was like, oh, fiction seems so hard because you have to make stuff up. And then, of course, the fiction writers were like, I don't know how you write nonfiction. Like, fiction's so easy because you just make everything up.
Yeah.
But I would love to do that. And I also, there's a lot of things I've never really been able to do. Like, I would love to have the time to, like, go to a writing residency, or, like, have an extended period of time to focus on a book. But at the same time, in reality, most people are writing in around the edges of their lives. So I can't complain too much.
Yeah. What piece of writing advice do you wish you could give your former self?
I think to do more of it. I mean, I didn't know that writing was a thing people could do, like, for a job or for their life when I was growing. I don't know. I think I've talked to a lot of writers who grew up sort of in families where writing wasn't part of in the air and who say the same thing. It's like, oh, I just thought these books kind of appeared, and it never occurred to me that like live people are currently writing books. So I wish I had given myself that kind of gift, I think, of thinking of writing as a real thing real people do. Yeah, it took a while to really come to terms with that, even subconsciously.
What's one tip for writers trying to get a book published?
I think it's to really define what kind of a book writer you want to be. Like, why are you doing this? Is it for fame? Because that is not something you're going to get, probably, unless you're extraordinarily lucky. Is it for money? Like, that can be tricky. You may or may not get it. Is it because you're really interested in the topic? Then that's probably a good reason. But the thing to remember, and I do tell younger writers this sometimes, is that the magazine articles you write or whatever, they're kind of written in pencil where, like, they're out there, but people don't necessarily think of them as like your one thing that you've written. But a book is in ink and it will follow you around the rest of your life. And so you better make sure you want your name on that book. And I definitely know younger writers who kind of got excited because a publisher approached them about writing a book, often about their lives, and now they're 40 and regretting it because that was not a story they wanted to give up the way that they did. So I think just be very careful about that kind of thing.
That's a good tip. What's your all-time favorite piece of your own writing? Could be anything.
I don't know, but at the moment, I was rereading. I don't usually reread my own writing, but I was rereading yesterday just because of a tweet I read, a piece I wrote early this year after I went to an 8-hour Jackass-a-thon at the
Oh my goodness.
Museum of the Moving Image in Queens right before Jackass Forever came out. And I'm always proud of myself when I read a piece of writing and I realize like I was funny and I also said something, because that is not necessarily my normal mode of writing. And I feel like I nailed it with this one. And I reread it and I was like, I think I tweeted it back out and said, if I ever publish a collection of criticism, I just know this is going to be the lead essay. And I'm like, not sure if I should feel embarrassed about that. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's I think it's titled like How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Jackass or something like that. But it was a blast.
Awesome.
Thank you so much to Alissa. I had a fantastic writer chat with her and loved reading Salty and familiarizing myself with her work. So make sure you find her on the internet and stay in touch.
I'm mostly on Twitter. My handle there is Alissa Marie, because I got Twitter in 2007 and never thought that I would need my last name in my handle, and now somebody has it and won't give it back. So, so Alissa Marie, and all my magazine work is on Vox with a V.
That is it for this edition of The Bleeders. But if you're already hungry for more, make sure you check out the last episode with Matt Bell. He's a novelist and author of the craft book, Refuse to Be Done: How to Write and Rewrite a Novel in 3 Drafts. And here's a little preview from that conversation.
I think one of the things that's worked for me for a long time is like the day before deciding what I'm going to start out doing. I often review the pages I wrote the day before, just flip through the manuscript before I go to bed. And I stop as soon as I find something to fix, right? I'm like, oh, I'm going to rewrite this opening, or here's a typo even in a sentence. And then it's just like you leave yourself a little note and you get to the desk and you're like, what am I doing today? And you're like, well, I can at least rewrite that opening paragraph. And by the time you're done with that, you're in.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Bleeders. Writing is so much better with friends. I'm your host, Courtney Kosak, and hey, let's connect on social media. I am at Courtney Kosak, Kosak, on Twitter and Instagram. And make sure you're signed up for the Bleeders Companion Substack. There's a link in the episode description for that. And join me again in 2 weeks for another all-new episode. In the meantime, happy bleeding!